This is a really beautiful poem that's studied massively because it's so beautiful, and one of the big reasons it's so beautiful is that it is just metaphor on metaphor on metaphor. And what that means is that there have been loads of different interpretations of the different metaphors, and I'm just adding my 2p. There'll be a lot in common with other analysis out there, and hopefully I'll have my own little unique perspectives too. But the most important thing to take away from this, my interpretation is by far from the only one, and I would love for you to comment down on this video about your thoughts about what different parts of it mean. So let's get stuck into the actual poem itself. This poem is about death, specifically how we should as human beings meet death. And the speaker of this poem leaves us in no doubt about how we should be handling death from the very first line. Do not go gentle into that good night, with good night being a euphemism for death. This poem uses apostrophe, which means that the speaker of the poem, we don't know who they are, is speaking to somebody. We don't know in the beginning of the poem who that is either. Now, what that allows at the first few stanzas of the poem is for it to feel like the poem has a universality to it, because it feels like this instruction is coming to us. This instruction of do not go gentle, it could be to anybody. However, what we're going to realize towards the end of the poem, and you, my father, is that in fact the speaker of this poem is a child, whether adult or actual child, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. And their parent, the father, is dying, and they don't want them to. So this whole poem is actually a command from child to parent. I'm going to analyze the significance of that when we reach that stanza. But for the first few stanzas, we don't have that information, and therefore it gives the poem a feeling of like just a general mantra for all humans of how we should approach death. We should rage against that dying of the light. And the overarching structure of the poem is this. So in this first stanza, our speaker sets out, if you will, their sort of argument for how we should handle death. It's do not go gentle in that into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. So you should fight back. And we know that because we've got this juxtaposition between old age, which usually connotes like frailty, weakness, with these verbs of burn and rave that are very intense, very active, full of energy. So it's this image of fighting, even when you are at your weakest, most frail, perhaps you technically, because of your age, closest to death, you should be fighting against it. And at close of day is another euphemism for death. I'm going to tell you some more about those euphemisms in a second, but for now, just note that it is a euphemism for death. So our argument for how we should approach death in old age specifically is to fight back. What the next stanzas then do is Dylan Thomas goes through different individuals who you would expect to not fight death for different reasons, but actually they do, and he goes through why. So the different people you've got not fighting death, and as we go stanza by stanza, we'll look in more detail about why they're fighting. But you've got wise men, good men, wild men, and grave men. And then finally, his father. So all these different people who should be fighting death or do fight death. Now, the reason I hedged my phrase in there, or should be fighting death or do fight death, is because of the way his grammar works in all the different stanzas. If we take, for example, just this stanza here for wild men. Wild men who caught and sang the song in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Because of the English language, there are two different ways to interpret the grammar of that sentence. Either he's saying wild men don't go gentle into the good night. He's making a statement. Or he's saying wild men, guys, seriously, listen to me, do not go gentle into that good night. Or he's making a command. The only stanza that doesn't apply to is the wise men, because the grammar, no light, because they're words for no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. So there it's an observation of something they do. and then the last one with his father, where it's clearly a command. These other three, the grammar doesn't make it clear. Now, why does that matter? Why does that lack of clarity on the grammar matter? Well, because it raises two different ways of looking at what these stanzas are trying to achieve, right? So one way of looking at it, let's imagine that all of these stanzas, apart from father, but where he's providing his examples, grave men, wild men, good men, wise men, all of these are him stating outright, look at these different kinds of men, they do not go gentle. In that case, what these stanzas become is they are examples to illustrate his argument of how we should approach death. However, if it's actually a command, so like he's telling these good men, rage, rage, he's telling these wild men, do not go gentle, then the purpose behind those stanzas becomes he's set out his argument on how to approach death, and then he's speaking almost to like different sections of humanity and being like, almost like no matter what kind of man you are, whether you're a wise one or a good one or a wild one or a grave one, this is how you should be approaching death. That subtle nuance in grammar leaves the poem massively up for interpretation in the sort of stance our speaker is taking. I personally lean towards that for wise, good, wild, and grave, he is observing what they do as more like examples to his argument, and then by father, it's the command. The reason I make that argument is because definitely the grammar of wise men leaves us in no doubt he's observing what wise men do. I think it therefore makes logical sense that if wise men is an example, good men, wild men, and grave men are also examples, rather than for wise men, he decided to just observe what they do anyway, and then all the others he wanted to like speak to them and make a case. Do you see what I mean? Like he's applying his practice consistently of giving examples of different men that approach in different ways. By giving examples of different men that all approach death in this sort of raging against the dying of the light, it makes sense as a sort of let me set out my argument and then put forward examples of why my argument stands true. So that's why I lean towards, although again, it's up to interpretation, I lean towards in all of these, when he says, you know, rage, rage against the dying of the light, do not go gentle into that good night, he's stating that that's what these men do, rather than commanding that they do that. So I'm just going to put a little note at the top here. Is he commanding or observing? But you're going to need to make some more detailed notes for yourself to remember the sort of nuances to that argument. Now, in this first stanza, where he's setting out his argument on how we should approach death, there's an interesting irony, okay? Because on the one hand, the use of the imperatives, the commands of do not go gentle, rage, rage against the dying of the light, plus that imagery, like I was saying before about the burn and the rave and its connotations of like intense passion and force, it creates a very sort of defiant tone to this poem. And yet, nowhere in this poem does the speaker use the word death. He only uses euphemisms. Good night, close of day, dying of the light. And we'll see more euphemisms in the other stanzas as well. But nowhere does the poem use the word death. If we take good night as the first euphemism, that is a positive euphemism for death, because within it implies a sort of rest because of night suggesting it's sleep, and the fact that it's a good night, perhaps, you know, a long rest free from any kind of pain and suffering. Close of day has an almost business-like detachment to it, so it's a euphemism for death that tries to keep it unemotional. It's just like you close a business at the close of day, you close your life, you end your life at the close of day. And then the dying of the light is a negative euphemism for death. It creates such an image, if we think of light as being, yes, a symbol for life, but why a symbol of life? Because of the energy and the brightness and the joy, and then to have that dying, negative euphemism. Now, yes, dying is the verb of death, but still the fact that he talks about light dying rather than a person dying means it's still a euphemism. What is the significance of that irony? It holds within it a subtle suggestion that's going to become much clearer in our last stanza, that our speaker, although they want us to defy death, fight against it, also has within them a fear of it, and therefore they can't even bring themselves to say the word. What we realise in this last stanza is that he has a reason. And I'm saying he just because the writer was Dylan Thomas, but it's not necessarily an autobiographical poem at all. The you is speaking to their dying father, and therefore it makes sense that they might not feel ready to actually use the word death and be so forthright with it. So one of the things I'm going to talk about when we reach this final stanza is that actually there's a whole different way to interpret the tone of this poem. Yes, you can see it as being like passionate and defiant, fight against death. But an argument I'm also going to be making later as a whole different way to read the poem is that actually this is a pleading, desperate tone of somebody who's just like, don't leave me. Don't die. Please, 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 please don't die. And I think the constant euphemisms for death are part of that. I think the imperatives can be seen as part of that as well. And then what's going to happen in the final stanza, which I'll talk about when it comes to it, also part of that. So I'm mainly going to be talking in the beginning about a defiant tone, but again, multiple interpretations. This could be read as a pleading, desperate tone as well. So like I said before, in the next stanzas, he goes through our different kinds of men and why they not necessarily fear death, but certainly don't want to die, why they resist in the end of their lives. What's interesting about the different men he's chosen is they are men you would expect to be fine with dying, but they're not. And so I think part of what, you know how I said there's a universality to this poem? I think part of the universality is Dylan Thomas examining the reasons why humans don't happily, readily go to death a lot of the time. And he's examining some of the reasons why. So with our first one, though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Our wise men, wise obviously denoting like knowledge, no dark is right. So the dark, he constantly uses darkness to symbolize death. So it's another euphemism for death essentially. And he uses light to symbolize life. So when they know that death is right, what that means is because they are intelligent, they know the inevitability of it. Okay? They know all human beings must die. It is a part of life. But here's why they still resist. Because their words had forked no lightning. That metaphor of forking no lightning. We can think of lightning as being something that causes a great noticeable impact. People pay attention to lightning. And because they want to be the one to fork it, to cause it, it becomes a metaphor for making a difference, having an impact, causing a shock, if you will, in the wider world. So our wise men, our men of knowledge and intellect, want to have had an impact with that knowledge and intellect. Their words are symbolizing, the impact they have had in this world with all the knowledge they've got. And because they realize they haven't had an impact, they resist death. They do not go gentle into that good night. The comment this is making about human beings, it's like we want to make a difference for our own self-interest. These men want to be someone who will be remembered when they go. And if they feel like they haven't made a significant impact on this world, they don't want to die. It's safe to say the good men of our next stanza has perplexed many a person who, has English degrees and all sorts, because the metaphor is a very interesting image. Dare I say, maybe not that great, because it's confused so many people. So I understand if you read this and were just like, what? Because it's flummoxed plenty of people. Again, though, that just means there's loads of room for interpretation, so throw your interpretations down below. I think there's two ways of looking at our good men. First of all, we take good men just to mean in terms of men who want to make a difference in the world. So while our wise men, it was about forking lightning because of self-interest, they want to feel like they had power and impact in this world. For our good men, it's about wanting to make a difference in the world because that's the right thing to do. When we see good men, the last wave by, so that last wave is like waves of life could be seen as. So they're in the last wave of their life, they're near the end of their life, and they are crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. If we're going to have to break this down into little chunks and then put it all back together again to create our overarching meaning. Frail deeds is referring to the things they have achieved, the good things these good men have tried to do. However, the word frail connotes it's something sort of weak, and therefore it could be suggesting that their deeds are not yet done. That's why they're frail. They're sort of only partially completed, fitting with that idea of how, when good people are trying to change the world, it's not changed in a day, right? If you're trying to work to defeat poverty, like your deeds might be frail because there's just such a small thing in this massive problem, right? So it's this image of the individual things a man can do aren't that massive, aren't that big when they're trying to do good things. And what they're acknowledging with the might have, modal auxiliary verb of might, is highlighting the possibility. Towards the end of their life, they're thinking about how their continued good actions could be continuing to make a difference. So part of the reason why they're not wanting to die is the possibilities that exist in the future. And what those frail deeds might have done is been bright and danced in a green bay. That image is full of life and vitality. If we think green being like lusciousness and growth, if we think of dancing being joyous and happy, and we think of brightness, again, that energy and life, it's this idea of how if they are able to continue living, they could continue to add to the joyousness, the vitality of life, which is, what good men are trying to do, right? They're trying to make the world a better, happier place. And that is why, therefore, they rage against the dying of the light. I should note, by the way, I realised I haven't actually analysed the rage. Basically, the repetition of that, I think, is just adding to the passionate, forceful tone. So that's one interpretation. I'm now going to throw out there a whole different way of looking at this metaphor. And that is related to the fact that with the time period that Dylan Thomas is living in, he was born at the start of World War I. He was born in 1914. And so his life has been massively shaped by World War I and World War II. With that in mind, I think one way to interpret this whole stanza is it's talking about soldiers with an allusion to those world wars. Because so often it's really, really common to refer to men who fought in those wars as good men. So the last wave by makes me think instead of, how often you see those images where they were on trains and they're waving to their loved ones. And it's this idea of like, it was their last time leaving England and they're about to die and they're not going to make it back to England. Right? So it's their last wave where they saw off their loved ones because they're never going to go through that again because they're about to die at war. I think the frail deeds this time is referring to what little impact an individual soldier managed to have in those wars. They were very bloody, very violent, loads and loads of death. Might have danced in a green bay could perhaps be a reference to like the victory of war. They could have been part of leading to the victory, that dancing in a green bay, because so often if we think about the massive battles of, in particular, World War II, but certainly also World War I, so many of them happened in coastal locations. So I think a bay does have an association with fighting battles of war. And so like that dancing is like still that image of vitality, and that's why he's called it green, but I think is perhaps that sort of post-war celebration of like, we did it, we won. I think a whole other way to interpret this one is potentially it's talking about soldiers who are not going to make it through war, they're going to die, but they fight anyway because they know that their actions could contribute to the victory in the war. Next, we have our wild men. Now, our wild men who caught and sang the song in flight, a really gorgeous metaphor there. So they are people, if we again, continuing this symbolism. At this point, he's done it so many times, we can almost call it a motif, which is just where you use a repeated image or symbol. A motif of light symbolizing life. So with the sun, catching the sun, it's catching life, right? They have taken the most out of life that can be taken. And the fact that they sing it, it's like that joyous celebration of being part of it. They really enjoy life and live it to its fullest. What is so deep about this next line though is, and learn too late, they grieved it on its way. The grieving the sun on its way, they grieved sun. Now, if we think about flight being a metaphor for time, so grieved it on its way, they're grieving the passing of time. Why would you grieve the passing of time? Dylan Thomas is essentially making a really deep point that these people who are obsessed with living life to the fullest and getting it up to max, it's because they're afraid of dying. And so they feel like they have to live life to the max because they're so afraid of death that it's like they're clinging on to life. The little adverbial phrase, too late, is really interesting in adding that, you know, they aren't conscious of that themselves. They realize it later in their lives. And so these people who have made the absolute most of life, they also, essentially just the act of how they've chosen to live their lives by being wild with its connotations of like freedom. They've enjoyed life. They've been carefree. They rage against life, dying for that same reason as well, because they don't want the party to stop. Next, we have our grave men. There's a pun here because of a very famous Shakespeare reference from Romeo and Juliet.
Courage, man. The hurt cannot be much.
'Twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man.
Literally, grave means serious, but the pun from Mercutio was he was talking about the fact that he's going to be in a grave, he's going to be dead. Dylan Thomas has potentially taken advantage of that really well-known Shakespeare reference to make a comment of like, it's dying men. It's sort of pointing out, you know, that when you are near death because of sickness, you are also often a really serious, severe person. And what he says about these people and why they also fight against death is they see with blinding sight. We've got an oxymoron there in blinding sight because you can't, of course, see if you are blind. So the oxymoron of this is that on the one hand, these men who are near dying probably are blind or at least partially sighted now, right? There's a common aspect to getting really old. But also at the same time, they can see something with a strong sight. What they have is insight. They've lost their physical sight and they've gained insight. They've gained an understanding of this world. And what they have gained insight on is in the next line. Who see with blinding sight that blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. So our blind eyes is a symbol for physical frailty, physical weakness, but that is juxtaposed against the image that in the simile of blazing like meteors. It's very, very similar to what I was saying about in the first stanza of old age should burn and rave. It's juxtaposing an image of physical weakness with an image of power, of strength, the blaze like meteors, think of a meteor as being an unstoppable, powerful force. And then of course, be gay literally denotes happiness. What he's pointing out is that what people have learned and realize when they get older, that blinding sight, that really strong thing they've realized is that it is possible to be old, to be frail, to have failing physical health, and still be happy, to still blaze, to still be full of passion and vigor and want to fight. That classic disconnect where just because your body is failing you doesn't mean your mind is. You know, emotionally, you can still be a really strong, powerful person. And therefore, they also rage against the dying of the light. They don't want to die either. Now, with all of these examples in mind, Thomas has been through all these different kinds of men and their different reasons why they rage. Now we have almost where he makes it personal, because he uses this direct address of you, my father. And by adding that little detail of my father, it makes it it takes it from being a universal poem to making it personal, very personal. And he says, and you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. So what's this sad height that his father is on? My theory is it's his deathbed. Why a sad height? Now, if we want to get technical, let's be honest, Thomas needed a word that rhymed with night. And so he's trying to think, okay, how can I talk about a deathbed and make it rhyme with night? And so it talks about the height that his father is laying at. Why is it a sad height? For this, I actually think of a moment in the TV show This Is Us, which if you are over the age of 15 and looking for an incredibly beautiful drama, I highly recommend.
I used to love waking you up in the morning when you were a child. You looking up at me with those big, beautiful eyes. And now I'm down here. You're up there.
And that was actually a really sad position to be in, because usually you're looking up to your parent. And there's a sort of comfort in that, almost like they're an authority looking down over you, caring for you. Whereas when the roles are reversed and you're looking down on them and they're in this position of sort of weakness, all of a sudden it feels really sad. That's where I think it's a deathbed. I think he is looking down at his father at this sad height of being below him, lying on a bed. And he says, curse, bless me. Now, I think the use of the antithesis of curse and bless is essentially our speaker pleading anything. Just give me something. Talk to me in some way. I don't care if you're going to bless me. I don't care if you're going to curse me. Just engage with me. Do something. Because both curse and bless are quite powerful emotions on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Curse obviously being more in the anger, bless in the happiness. But he just wants his father to show some passion, some vigor, and engage with him. And he wants him to curse, bless with fierce tears. Now, again, tears would suggest an emotional outlet, and then fierce with its powerful connotations, it's like he wants him to show strong emotion. So what he is essentially asking overall is for his dad to show him that he is fighting against death, that he is not going willingly. And that's why we then have our lines, do not go gentle into that good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now, you will have undoubtedly noticed the structure of this poem and the repetition of the lines, do not go gentle into that good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light. This poem actually follows a very specific poetic form called a villanelle. And it's possibly one of the most famous, if not the most famous villanelle out there. And so Dylan Thomas is following a set of strict rules about the lines of his poem. So wherever you see do not go gentle into that good night being repeated, Dylan Thomas didn't have a choice about that. Because he was writing a villanelle, he had to repeat that line there. Ditto, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wherever you see that line repeated, he had to repeat it there because of the way the poem works. Now, obviously, he's used it masterfully, because part of the reason a poet will use villanelles is how you can subtly change the meaning each time that you use it. So, of course, one of the ways we see Dylan Thomas do it is it shifts from a command to like an observation, a declarative statement of what wise men, good men, wild men do. And then when he's able to put them together at the very end of the poem, it creates a crescendo of forceful passion right at the end. Another reason, though, that I think he does it, a villanelle is an incredibly strict poetic form. You know, you have to follow a particular rhyme scheme. You have to repeat certain lines in a particular way. It doesn't leave a lot of room. And I think that in itself is symbolic of the sort of strict rules of life within which we all operate, that inevitability of death, that almost guaranteed that it's going to happen again and again and again, that people are going to die. And yet the words of the poem are all against sort of fighting against the inevitability of something. So I think what the villanelle quite nicely captures is this feeling of a struggle between something that is going to happen, you can't stop it, that line is going to repeat because this is a villanelle, and yet the tone of the poem being rage, fight, don't just accept it. So I think the structure versus the language of this poem manages to encapsulate that struggle between the inevitability of something and wanting to fight against that inevitability. So with all of that in mind, I said that this poem predominantly has a defiant tone to it. And yet when we realise this is someone essentially begging their father to fight against death, and the whole poem can take on a much more pleading, desperate tone. But I don't think that really obviously comes through until we reach this last stanza with the antithesis of the curse bless of just please, just in any way fight. The combination where I do not go gentle and rage are finally put together in a couplet. The desperation in the two imperatives side by side like that. That's where our pleading tone really comes through and sort of reshapes the way we see the poem as a whole. The euphemisms for death that I talked about in the beginning, and the fact that the word death is never actually used in this poem, that's a much more subtle hint right towards the beginning. But overall, I think the beauty of this poem is that it doesn't really matter which interpretation you take. You could absolutely have a solid read of this poem where it is an almost war cry of fighting against death and refusing to accept death lightly. And you could have a totally valid reading of this poem where it's an incredibly sad, emotional, desperate pleading, please dad, don't leave me. And I think that is so beautiful and just shows the power of language and metaphor. And I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.